So I am really excited. I've been looking forward to this event ever since I dreamt it up in November. Francine Segan is the author of this wonderful cookbook, Shakespeare's Kitchen. And Chef Jessica and I have been talking for years about having an event that would be about Shakespeare's Kitchen. And as I was looking through Francine's book, trying to get ideas, I thought, well, why don't we just have Francine come? And so I emailed her, and she was very forthcoming and excited to talk to us about her passion, which is food history. And so we're going to be hearing from Francine. She's also written a wonderful book on classical philosophy in foods. Maybe we'll bring her back again for another exciting event. But today we're going to really focus on the Elizabethan kitchen and food as it appears in Shakespeare. And we're going to also have some recipes demonstrated by our wonderful partner, Chef Jessica VanRoo, here at the Anteater Recreation Kitchen.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be with everyone. So for the next bit, I am going to talk about the wonderful, fanciful foods and feasting of Shakespeare's time. The food was amazingly delicious and fun and interesting. They ate things like peacocks and swans. In fact, you see here in this beautiful painting, the wide range of foods that were prepared for a feast. They ate everything. Most particularly, I was really fascinated reading chapter after chapter on pies. Pies are a wonderful vehicle for the fancifulness of the Elizabethan feast. And you see in this painting that there is a swan that's sitting on a pie crust. And that would have been an actual swan that would have been skinned so the feathers stay intact. And then the swan would have been roasted and the feathers put back on, and the swan put on top of a pie that was filled with swan meat. And this would have been one of the wonderful things sent out to the table. I had hundreds and hundreds of pies that are featured in various cookbooks of the time, even turkey pie and meat pies. They loved to decorate the crust of the pie to reflect what was inside the pie. So the way we saw the swan on top of a pie, this pie crust is a recreation of one from Elizabethan kitchens where the boar meat that is inside is recreated on the outside in the crust. And you see the gilding. That also is very common in those Elizabethan kitchens. They would also make the pie into the shape of what was inside. And today we're going to see this pie be made by our wonderful Chef Jessica. This is a salmon pie with some very bizarre ingredients. In fact, when I first read this recipe, I thought I would make it as an experiment for some guests as a way to show how terrible Elizabethan food was. And to my thinking from just reading it, it seemed kind of strange. There was salmon, pistachios, artichoke, asparagus, mussels or clams. I just thought it was going to be a horrendous hodgepodge. I made it and made a small portion and gave all the guests a little spoon to have just a taste. Everyone was furious with me. It was delicious. They wanted more. It turned out that crazy combination of flavors and textures actually worked really well. And so we'll see how that's made a little later on. Even today, the English are kind of whimsical with their pies. And today there's a pie that dates from the Elizabethan period. It's called stargazy pie, where a fish pie with all the heads of the fish poking out of the crust, something that they did very regularly. They would like to not only decorate the pie, but also have the ingredients actually poking out from the pie crust. Now, pies were often a part of the whimsical part of the dinner. Sometimes they weren't even edible. There was recipes for pies that were just intended to be showstoppers, something to wow the guests. We know the rhyme, 4 and 20 blackbirds. It's true. It was a recipe. They explained to the chef how He should blind bake a crust, bake the crust with nothing in it, and then put in live birds. Cover it quickly with the top crust and send it to the table. Give the guest of honor a dull knife so that when he cuts into the pie, no birds are hurt, but they'll be released into the room and fly about. What I particularly liked about that recipe was the last line that said, if you're having trouble tethering the birds, don't worry, this recipe will delight if you use garden snakes or frogs also. I like when they give you substitution for ingredients in recipes. Another thing that they incorporated into the meal for a wow factor was to sculpt and shape the food. For example, this is one of my favorite recipes, pears in broth. Pears, it is actually chopped meat, seasoned, and then shaped into the shape of a small pear with a little herb at the top. They even had a little extra conceit, which is that they explained to put a whole grape in the center of the pear so that when the guests bit into it, thinking they were getting a pear, but then realizing it was meat, they would still get a little tiny bite of fruit inside. And it's actually really delicious. A nice combination of sweet and savory. This idea of preparing food into other shapes is something that, of course, has remained, as we know from the wonderful marzipan sculptured fruits that are so popular in Sicily and other parts of the world. The Elizabethans also gave us many of our Christmas specialties like gingerbread men, because creating bread and cookies in the shapes, for example, of a guest of honor was very common. They would also create dinner rolls into various shapes. One of the recipes that was very fascinating was a dinner roll in the shape of a deer. And the instructions went on to explain that you should fill the dinner roll with wine jelly so that when the guests opened their dinner roll, it would seem as if the deer was bleeding. I know, they thought it was very appetizing sounding. And of course, we remember that in Elizabethan times, hunting deer was something that was only reserved for the wealthy. And so the idea of recreating that hunt was something appealing. Now, one of the things that's interesting when you look at a cookbook from Shakespeare's time is how different it looks from cookbooks today. For example, here's a page and you can see how dense the writing is. It's also not broken up into that little paragraph with ingredients and instructions. It was, again, very, very dense because paper was very, very rare. Some things we notice when we read it that are missing, that are common today, are time. We now easily will see a recipe that says bake for 10 minutes. Not so in Shakespeare's time. Clocks were expensive and would never have been found in a kitchen. And so other kinds of hints had to be given to the cook. One of my favorites was instructions for how long to cook asparagus. And the instructions said, cook them for as long as it takes to say the Lord's Prayer twice. It actually turns out pretty good timing for asparagus, which doesn't need very much cooking time. The other thing that's missing, of course, is the temperature on the oven. There were no thermostats to control temperature. And so they would give other clues. For example, there was one for baking rolls that said, make the oven hot enough so that you can keep your hand in the oven for the count of 12. So I'm in the kitchen testing for Shakespeare's Kitchen and doing that. And it turns out that I can keep my hand in for about 12 seconds with 350 degrees, which was perfect for those rolls. Now, today we have drugstores on every corner. Not so in Shakespeare's time. Instead, cookbooks would be often a source for remedies and cures. And these cookbooks would be a way that the household could prepare things for illnesses. And when you read them, it's fascinating. There are things like cherry bark that's repeated on and on as a cure for sore throats. And of course, we know cherry bark and the flavor of cherry is very popular in cough drops and cough medicines because cherry indeed does soothe a sore throat. Many people believe that a copper bracelet will help with arthritis. And in Elizabethan times, they believed that cooking with coins would help joint aches. And there would be these elaborate stews that were called for cooking many, many hours with various coins in them. That's not actually as strange as it sounds. You may know that cooking in a cast iron pot is a wonderful way to increase iron for anyone iron deficient or who'd like to get more iron in their diet. There were dozens and dozens of recipes that kept alluding to the fact that you could cure deafness, cure it with a roasted onion. I was intrigued, and luckily I was doing research in the New York Academy of Medicine, a medical facility that had a huge culinary collection because there were so many remedies that the physicians wanted to explore the history of. And so I got the chance to ask some doctors seated near me, is anyone an eye, ear, and throat specialist? And a few people came over and I said, why are there so many cookbooks that claim that you can cure deafness? If we knew this, this would be revolutionary. And they explained that actually about 15% of the population over age 50 develops a earwax that is so thick it actually blocks hearing. And so in Shakespeare's time, they would use this juice of the roasted onion, which actually has an enzyme that loosens the earwax. And so they thought it was an absolute cure. They weren't deaf anymore. Today we have the little blue pill, but back in Shakespeare's time, they used food. And there are many, many recipes that talk about increasing the seed in man. But there were also many that were directed to women. I especially liked one that was entitled, How to Make a Barren Woman Bear a Child. And the recipe goes on to explain that you need to make a pesto, grind up about 12 different kinds of nuts and about 20 different kinds of herbs, and eat that pesto twice a day, and use the leaves of all of the herbs to make a concoction that you would drink 3 times a day. And the instructions went on to explain that you should do this remedy, take this remedy every day for 40 days, and it guaranteed within the 40 days that a barren woman will become pregnant. The very last line of the recipe explains that during the period of taking the remedy, it might be beneficial to make the acquaintance of a man. Nowadays, we put the more important ingredients first, but back then. So we've got lots of appliances in the kitchen. A whisk, they didn't back then. They would have instructions in cookbooks of how to tie together twigs so that they could create their own whisks. We use a pastry brush to brush on egg white or butter. Back then, they would have instructed you to use a feather. We use toothpicks to close different food for appetizers. They did too, but they used a quill. We've got salad spinners. Back then, they would have instructed you to put all the lettuce in a big linen cloth and swing it around your head. It still works if you don't have a salad spinner. Here's a page from a beautiful Italian cookbook that was known in Shakespeare's England that has instructions for how to lay out a kitchen, including in one corner. Let me do my laser pointer here. You see this. The instruction for this was that you should take a bale of hay and hang it so that when you're using knives, you can put them into the bale of hay. It would not only clean the knives, but keep them from harm's way. And there's lots of other instructions on how to set up pasta making stations and instructions on how to create cookware and spits, pots, all would have been within cookbooks. So The Elizabethans were eating from snout to tail, all sorts of foods. And we can see references, interesting references in Shakespeare to foods, like in Taming of the Shrew, neat's foot, which is a calf's foot. They ate everything, including coxcomb, which is something that still today, actually, you can find in Italy in a dish called la financiera, a dish popular in northern Italy. There are a few spices that I want to mention because I thought they were so delicious and easy to find, actually, but they were new to me when I was doing research. One was cubeb, which looks kind of like an allspice with a tail, and it's wonderfully aromatic, kind of a combination of nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper. Long pepper, which isn't actually a pepper, but it looks like a little pine cone, but it's about the size of your pinky nail. Also has a wonderful heat, but a lot of aromatics. And the other that I thought was delicious, spicy, tingly, was grains of paradise. Those three are spices that are easy to find online, and I highly encourage you to look for them to add a little taste of Elizabethan food to anything simple, even a roast chicken. Now, one of the questions I'm always asked is, they put all these spices in foods. Was it to camouflage the fact that the meat was rancid? Absolutely not. I'm convinced because there were recipes that explain in the beginning of the recipe what time you should slaughter the animal so that you could properly prepare the dish in time for a feast. So these flavors were just appreciated and a part of the cuisine. They probably weren't quite as strong as the spices we have today because they were traveling on camels and in pouches that weren't airtight for hundreds of miles. So what would it have been like to attend a feast back in Shakespeare's time? You would have received your invitation and you would have arrived at the grand hall, and someone would have greeted you with a pitcher with scented water so you could have your hands washed after the dusty trip. And then you would be escorted to the table where you sat was very important, because not everyone received all of the wonderful dishes. Not everybody got the peacock. In fact, salt wasn't even at everyone's place. And the expression below the salt comes from the fact that only some people were seated near the salt and the others below it. You would have seen a white tablecloth, and you would have found that roll at your place, probably wrapped in your napkin, which you would have used to take home leftovers. You would not have found a fork. Forks were not known in Shakespeare's time. In fact, a travel writer traveling to the continent who saw them in Italy during Shakespeare's lifetime and wrote about it marveled at why gentlemen in the courts of Italy weren't sophisticated enough to know how to properly eat with their fingers. Wine was an integral part of dinners, and there were beautiful wine fountains on the table and wonderful dispensers like this, carved quartz. Now, we say to make a toast, and that saying dates to Shakespeare's time, as you see from this quote from Merry Wives of Windsor. The reason is that in Shakespeare's time, there were not yet bottled wine that was as delicious as what people would taste when they went to the continent. And so in England, they would put a piece of toast into the glass to act as kind of a charcoal filter. And the expression drink to the toast, meaning drink down, led to our drinking a toast. And toasting, that clinking your glasses together, because actually in Shakespeare's time, they weren't really glass. They were fairly expensive glasses. They used pewter, other metals. They would clink them together so hard so that one drink could slosh into the other, showing everyone assembled that we're drinking the same thing. And that was a way for the guest of honor to prove to the host that he's not being poisoned. We drinking to your health. Everyone is having the same thing. They were very worried about poison, as you know, in Macbeth. And there were many glasses that were created that were supposed to be antidotes, like this rhinoceros horn cup, or crystals were thought to prevent it. There were lots of games with drinking, like this pas glace, glasses like this with little secret holes and ways that you have to cover up different openings so that you could get your drink, as well as trick glasses like this one, which would crawl, mechanical glass that would crawl around the table, and you had to grab the glass quickly, drink, and get it back on before it got out of reach. Or this beautiful ship drinking vessel where you had to figure out which cannon you drank through and which you needed to cover to create the right vacuum. Then would come trumpeting, and the first courses would come, which are all little small, wonderful things like meat pies and things that we associate with appetizers, and fantastic, fanciful things like a roast suckling pig with a capon sitting on top of it with the coat of arms. There would be entertainments, jugglers, magicians, all sorts of entertainments. And you as the guest would also be expected to entertain. And there were etiquette books that explained jokes. For example, there was one book that I read that was published during Shakespeare's lifetime that listed jokes, kind of the way the old-time Henny Youngman sort of comedians in the Borscht Belt would do. One joke, for example, said that suddenly there was a storm at sea, and the captain ran to the ship and asked all the passengers, please, who can throw something overboard to lighten our load? And a man quickly raised his hand and said, I can, my wife. Well, I'm thinking as Henny Youngman did research in the same places I did to get these jokes, but it was pretty funny for $15.99. I will end this section on a riddle, which was very common to have riddles that you'd kind of memorize and bring with you to the feast so that you could share. And this one sounds like it's X-rated, but it's actually a PG answer, you'll see. And thus my riddle doth begin. A maid would have a thing put in, and with her hand she brought it to. It was so meek it would not do. But at length she used it, so that to the hole she made it go. And when it had done as she could wish, aha, quoth she, I'm glad of this. So what do you think? What do you think she was trying to get in the hole? She was, well, I don't know what you thought. Well, don't say it out loud, but she was threading a needle. All right, so then we would enjoy the next courses, which would have been larger pieces of meats and fish. And now I will stop here so that we can learn how to make that delicious salmon pie.
That was wonderful, Francine. And our reminder to the audience, if you have questions, you can put those into the Q&A. We also do have a live chat, so you can just ooh and ah over some of the pictures that we're seeing and the jokes that we're seeing, and just kind of enjoy the evening together. Take it away, Chef Jessica.
All right, so I'm going to show you that beautiful pie that Francine showed you. I'm going to try to make it that beautiful, but I'm going to do half of this. And so, like I said, I will be sending out these recipes at the end of the event so that you too can make them. And so this salmon dish actually uses puff pastry. So you can just go out and buy puff pastry, and Pillsbury is usually the one that we have around, and you keep it frozen until you're ready to use it. And so I let it out, and it is just a small sheet like this. I'm going to do half the recipe. The recipe that I'm sending you serves 12 people. And so I'm going to do half of that portion, which I think is enough. And what that entails is me taking this piece of dough, and I'm going to roll it out a little bit, and I'm going to cut it in half. So I put a little bit of flour on top of it, and I'm just going to roll it around. And if you notice, I'm doing everything on the parchment sheet. It just helps with transferring it. I've tried this recipe out, and it's amazing. When we talk about food, we always talk about flavors and complementing flavors. And so we always want our sweet, our sour, our savory, our umami, and textures too are also super important in food. So what this recipe actually does is it encompasses all of those things. It's sweet, it's savory, and it's got a little bit of a crunch to it too. So I'm gonna put that rolled out kind of puff pastry to the side, and then I've got a piece of salmon here. And you want a boneless, skinless piece. If you want to know a good place to buy salmon, I always say Costco. And so if you have a piece of salmon like mine, what you're going to do is you want pieces that are about equal in size, about 2 inches by 3 inches. And what ends up happening is if you have this little tail at the end, it's usually thinner. So what I actually do is I'll tuck it underneath, and then I'm going to cut sections of this. And then for area, so you want it about equal size. And so I'll cut this in half. And then I'll do this too. So I've got even pieces of fish that I'm then going to put into my, that I'm going to put inside my parchment. Now let's get the rest of the ingredients together. These are the other great ingredients. We have some pistachios, artichoke bottoms. So if you don't know what artichoke bottoms are, Instacart didn't know either. So artichoke hearts are what we normally see in the grocery store. And so it's an artichoke, and it's got like that kind of side coming up. Even the canned ones, even the frozen ones have a little bit more of that leaf to it. These are artichoke bottoms. And so it's just the bottom of the artichoke. And you can find them in the can section usually. And there's about 8 or 9 in each one. And so you only need about half. So I have 4 that I'm going to use, and I'm going to slice them. So I'm just going to thinly slice them. And if you want to cut them smaller, you sure can. Then the other ingredient are green grapes. Now the recipe says that you can also use gooseberries. Gooseberries are a little hard to find, but I don't want you to make the mistake that I made. Nowadays you see these guys around, and I'm sure this could probably work well inside. These are Cape Cod gooseberries. They are not, or golden berries. They are not real gooseberries though. They look similar, but they're not the same. So you could probably use these. If you've never tried them before, they're really good. They're tart, but they have more of a bite. It has like more of a skin on it. So I've got green grapes that I'm going to use, and you can just roughly chop them. I halved them. It's really cool having the grapes inside, just because it lends that sweetness and that little sourness to this dish. And then, so I've got all these on the side. And then I have asparagus. So 6 or 12, so I'm doing half, so 6 asparagus stalks. I just wanted to show you, when you buy these asparagus, what you want to do is you want to flex or kind of bend at the asparagus. Where it breaks, so if it breaks there, that's where I'm going to chop from. Most asparagus is picked as a bunch, and so they're around, and so they're growing at the same time. So you can just pop one and then cut from there. And then I want 1-inch sections, okay? And you don't need to blanch them. You don't need to do any of that. The residual heat, the heat from that puff pastry and the steam will cook that for you. And then we have mussels, smoked mussels. So I bought a can. You can buy whatever kind you want. You can use oysters too. I actually was able to find oysters easier than I was able to find mussels. They smell really good. They're smoked, and so they lend that kind of smoky flavor to it. Now let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my salmon, grab a bowl, and I'm going to season my salmon. So I'm going to add a little bit of salt and pepper. And if you guys have not seen this, I'm about to lose it. This is fresh nutmeg. So nutmeg comes in a nutmeg, like a nut like this. It lasts a lot longer. If you don't use that much nutmeg at home, buy them like this, use a microplane, and just shave as much as you need. And then you can take that nutmeg and you can use it. This lasts a lot longer than if you were using the pre-ground stuff. So I'm just gonna mix that, make sure everything is seasoned, and there we go. Now I'm gonna grab I'm gonna move everything to the side. Switch it around, because I did this once and I did not do it on the actual parchment, and and that was a mistake because transferring it was not easy. So I've got that. I'm gonna kind of figure out where half is. So I'm gonna cut this in half, just like that. I'm gonna keep one side, keep a piece to the side. And I'm gonna lay my salmon piece. Oh, I'm gonna start with my asparagus right on the bottom. And then I'm gonna lay my salmon on top. So fit what you can. You'll play around with the proportions a little bit. That little piece was extra. Just like that. And then I'll add my mussels and my asparagus, my grapes. And then the most important part was the chopped pistachios. And so I'm going to chop up some pistachios. What I found was also if you do half of it, you're left with one piece, an extra piece of the puff pastry, so you can make some designs. And I'll show you how I did some of the designs. So I'm going to grab some pistachios. And get them already kind of hold for you so it's easier. And just you can put them in the food processor to do like a really fine grind on them. Or if you feel comfortable enough with a knife, just go in there and chop it up as fine as you can. Again, this provides that really cool crunch. And pistachios just have a really cool flavor that most nuts don't, or it's just a different flavor. So I'm gonna add that, sprinkle that right on top. Just like that. All right, now I'm gonna grab my saved piece of dough and I'm gonna put it right on top and pinch. Now comes the fun part. You're gonna make this into a fish, or try to make it into a fish, or design it to be so. So I grabbed a knife and I kind of just played around with it and made that part, and make sure you seal it all so that nothing comes out. And this is when that extra piece sometimes helps. So I'm going to keep going around. Right. And then a tail. So what I did was I pushed one end in, and I can kind of get a tail out of here, or that could be the head area too. But then what I did was I took the dough and any extra flour you might have, roll it out. And if you have a cutter or something that can kind of give you a shape of a scale, you can go around and you can put the scales on. This takes a long time, so take your time with it, but you can lay your scales on, or you can take a spoon and you can make indentations throughout the whole thing, okay? So you would just go through the whole thing and make indentations. Then you're gonna brush it with a little bit of your egg wash, because you're using puff pastry, and sometimes adding the egg wash on top and then putting the scales on helps too. And then you're gonna pop this in your oven and you're gonna bake it. I'm gonna bake it for about 40 minutes, 20 minutes, and then I checked on it a little bit after that. And so then after that, we take it out of the oven and ba-bam, we have a full fish ready to go. So I don't know if you guys can kind of see that. There we go. All right, so with the scales and the tail. Should I cut through this, Julia? Francine, should I cut through it?
Sure.
Yeah, let's
Go
see
for
what
it,
it's
right?
like.
All right,
Yeah.
I've been waiting. I've been waiting to cut through it. So I am going to cut it and show you what it looks like inside. I'm going to take my knife and cut right through the middle. And there's this beautiful filling. I just want to show you the layers. That's why, because it's really pretty. But there you go. There's like that beautiful filling right in the middle. So it's very impressive and not that hard, everyone. Okay. And you can play around with the ingredients, like do different types of filling, do a different vegetable, whatever's around. But it was a lot of fun to make, Francine. So thank you for sharing that.
So are there some things to be careful with, like not make it too wet? And Francine, I know you've cooked this dish also. If we were going to experiment with the recipe and add different kinds of vegetables, would you like, the asparagus is probably good because it's kind of on the drier side. Won't get your
I love playing around with things, but I often like to try it the first time the way it was intended, except if you really know your ingredients well. This combination was really, really great because too strong of a flavor, like broccoli would overpower the fish. So try it the way it was written first, and then sure, if you have trouble, certainly as Jessica found, instead of artichoke hearts, you could use instead of the bottoms, you could use artichoke hearts, gooseberries, grapes, any color grapes. So, but it's really fun, and it's really the artist in you, and any kids at home who would like to do a little sculpting. It really is kind of fun to play with your food.
Well, I know you started this as a kind of cooking project with your kids for school, and it became a cookbook.
Exactly, really, really fun.
Amazing that one can learn history and drama through these tactile activities. Before we move back to the PowerPoint, there's a couple of questions here about this dish from our audience. One is from Valerie, who asks whether either of you can recommend a wine to pair with the salmon.
Francine?
White wine, your favorite white wine, a nice dry white wine that you would drink with fish. Salmon is nice and oily, and so that I think it can stand up to whatever you'd like, a good Chardonnay.
And then Ellen Murowitz asks if there's a kosher substitute for the smoky mussels or oysters. What would you add if you were trying to do
you could omit them.
You could omit them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I probably wouldn't want to go with anchovy or anything too strong, right?
Maybe a little. I think anchovy is always good in everything. And so I think a little anchovy would be excellent. Good call, Julia.
And Sue Purcell says, how about chestnuts?
Yum. That's good thinking. Yes, that's a good ingredient substitution. And feeling of the Elizabethan period of a food that they really loved. Good choice.
Wow. Well, we're going to turn back to the PowerPoint and hear about the end of the meal, the dessert course, and then we'll return to Jess and get some more suggestions about how to cook some of these desserts.
Wonderful. So now let's talk for a little second about the foods that Shakespeare didn't have, that they didn't have in Shakespeare's time. So there was no chocolate, no tea, despite the fact that England is so known for tea, no coffee, no chili peppers, no corn, no cranberries, no potatoes, no tomatoes. These were all foods that were discovered after Columbus, after the New World, and did not become popular in England until much later. In fact, there was pasta, but it wasn't eaten with tomatoes. It would have been eaten, for example, with prunes, cooked prunes. And in fact, in Shakespeare's day, prunes were often a synonym for a wanton woman. And they were often actually served in brothels as well, as they were thought to provoke passions. So foods that they didn't have, but they had lots and lots of foods that would be shared for dessert. Now, what happened is that you'd have that first course, all the little foods, then you would have the second course with bigger foods. In between, there would be entertainments, you'd be telling jokes, there would be wow dishes. And the idea that now we've come to the dessert, everyone knows each other better and things can get more bawdy and closer and even more fun. And so the jokes would have gotten even more intense. And there were lots that were recommended during the dessert period in case you were too shy in the first or second course. And so one of my favorites is basically the idea that a man is at home and he hears a burglar break in the middle of the night and he starts laughing. And the burglar is like, why are you laughing? And the man says, I don't know what you're going to find here in the dark. When I'm in the daylight, there's nothing of value that I ever see in my house. These are plates called rondelles that were the dessert plates. These are in a museum in England. And if you can look very, very closely, you see some writing. And that's because each of these plates had little funny sayings or whimsical poems, bawdy jokes. For example, this one is, a person who is generous with giving wine is never going to lack for anything. Or this one that's written on one of the plates, they made fun of lawyers forever, since ancient Roman times. Here lies a miracle denied who can. He lived a lawyer and an honest man. Poor lawyers. Now, the plates themselves were sometimes bawdy. This was from an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Gives new meaning to breastplate. This dessert plate, also, I just go a little closer so you get a sense of what was pictured in this plate. Anyway, this whole dessert course was considered to be an aphrodisiac. They wanted the guests to leave the dinner party and to go forth and multiply, to have fun. And so often, especially in the dessert, there would be aphrodisiacs. So certain fruit that was shaped like body parts were considered aphrodisiacs. So, for example, these were called fruit nipples, raspberries and cherries. And fruit was considered to be very luscious looking and very sensual. But the desserts themselves were recreated into body parts. This is called nun's breasts, a dessert that is still actually popular today. The dessert course always included cheese and nuts, just as it would today, cheese, nuts, and fruit. We see from this reference in Merry Wives of Windsor. And they would make all sorts of desserts with those ingredients. So there were wonderful nuts cooked with sugar into different kinds of brittles. And they would use every part of the fruit. Fruit was very precious. They would candy it when it was in season. They would candy the peels of the fruit. They would never waste anything. And this dessert, which Chef Jessica will make for us tonight, is a citrus tart. And the tart was made with lemon and orange peels that were candied and then simmered with vinegar and pepper. Very interesting combination that they prized back in Elizabethan times. They would have served slowly candied fruits of all kinds as part of the meal. And of course, the famous Christmas plum pudding, which would have been seen on an Elizabethan table. Because if you've ever made plum pudding, you know that it is all sorts of dried fruits that are simmered with spirits. And it lasts forever and it stays moist. So it's a wonderful dessert, and they prized it for that flavor combination and for its long lasting. This line shows us that certain interesting spices were used in desserts. Now, a warden was a pear in Elizabethan English. And so this pie would have had saffron and pear. Nowadays, we think nothing of these Michelin star chefs that will use interesting combinations of spices in desserts. But this is something that dates certainly to the Middle Ages and Renaissance. They also made vegetables into desserts. In fact, the person who found that you could extract sugar from parsnips was given a knighthood by Queen Elizabeth. So this is a delicious spinach pie that's mixed with spinach, ground almonds and sugar, and then topped with some other nuts, pine nuts. And of course, we've got vegetables as desserts still today, rhubarb pie and carrot cake. But there were some even more unusual ones in Shakespeare's time, including beets used in desserts. They sugar-coated spices. Spices, this is a beautiful painting illustrating sugar-coating these spices. And the idea of spices, especially during the dessert course, was something that was very prized. Spices were very expensive. 2 nutmeg would be the equivalent of a skilled carpenter's 1 month's salary. This is a recreation of an Elizabethan banquet table showing a gingerbread house, perhaps a recreation of the guest of honor's home, beautiful stained glass looking tarts made with jams, and ginger and all of these spices were really valued. In fact, gingerbread house, we get a little bit from that Elizabethan tradition of showing an esteemed house to guests. And all of these spices, ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon, all of these spices were thought to tingle the tongue. Any of those that were thought to tingle the tongue, it was also believed that they would tingle other places as well. And so they were considered aphrodisiacs and always included in the dessert course. After the dessert, the tables would have been picked up because tables weren't the way we think of today. They were not big dining tables that were sold. They were created to put on sawhorses. And so the table would have been picked up so that everyone could dance and there could be more entertainments. So now let's be entertained with how to create our own dessert. And so we'll go back to Chef Jessica so that we can learn how to make citrus tarts.
Making the rose cookies.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
my
you're
goodness.
Okay. No.
I wrote that. Okay, so I didn't even show you a picture of the rose cookies. My bad. Okay, I sent everyone, I think, the citrus tart recipe, but the rose cookies, let me just say, while Chef Jessica gets everything together, the rose cookies were from a recipe that was handwritten, and there was it's only in the Folger Library because there's just one copy of this book. A woman, Sarah Long, wrote this book as a gift, perhaps to her niece. Oh, thank you, Julia, for a picture of the rose cookies. And the idea of using flowers, besides using, of course, vegetables, was very, very common. They would use flowers in their salads and, of course, in their desserts. And rose water and orange blossom were very popular. So we're going to learn to make this adorable, beautiful rose cookie. However, in the list of recipes that Chef Jessica is going to send you, I do think that we've got the citrus tarts, so you can make them.
All right. So I have a pound of butter. Oh, no, sorry, not a pound of butter, half a pound of butter, 2 sticks of butter in here. And the recipe says to wash the butter with rose water. I believe that's what it said. And so we're not going to do that, but we are going to add some pretty cool stuff inside, including rose water and rose petals. And so I will get that. I'll show you that in a little bit. But in that butter, we're going to do what we do for baking most of the time, especially cookies. And that is we're going to cream butter and sugar together. This is probably the most important step of any baked baked goods or anything that you're trying to make in regards to a cookie, because butter and sugar react really well together. But they have to be combined well in order for it to actually react. And so if you've ever looked at sugar and felt it in between your hands, it's like little blades almost. It's sharp. What you're doing when you're creaming is you're actually incorporating that sugar, those little knives, into the butter, and it's cutting it then. So that each little piece of sugar is coated with a little bit of butter, and that's where you get that great mouthfeel. And so we're gonna cream these guys together, and we're gonna add egg yolks, and we're also gonna add some heavy cream. So I'm gonna start by separating my egg yolks, the eggs though, so that you can do this correctly. Now, what are you gonna do with extra egg whites at home? I always tell people they're great for your face and great for your hair, just don't use hot water. So if you have extra egg whites, old egg whites actually beat up better. So if you're interested in making macaroons, things like that, easier to make with old egg whites. So to separate them though, you're gonna get yourself 2 bowls. You're gonna hit once, and you're going to let that egg white fall off. Now, cold eggs are easier to separate, but when you're baking, you want to use room temperature ingredients, okay? We're gonna do it one more time. Separate it, let it fall through. If you ever get any kind of eggshell in there, like I did, not that we're using our egg whites, the inside of the egg has kind of a thin membrane. It almost acts like a magnet, and it'll attract that eggshell for you. So you don't have to use your finger to go in and dig it out. Just use a part of the eggshell, dip it in, and then you'll get it out. So we're not gonna use our egg whites, but we are gonna use our egg yolks in a little bit. I'm gonna come on over, and I'm gonna turn this guy on. Turn this thing on. There we go. And we're gonna cream. Now, if you don't have a KitchenAid, completely okay. Handheld mixer will work, and if you do it by hand, it does work. It just takes a little bit of time, okay? So just make sure if you are doing it by hand that it's a pretty smooth and fluffy consistency that you're at before you start adding other things. And that's it. So now I'm gonna add my heavy cream. I have a 1/4 cup of the rose syrup. I'm gonna only add half of it. And then I'm also gonna add my 2 egg yolks in there. Splashing people, it's not nice. And whenever you're doing this, you will notice it looks like it's curdled. It's completely okay. And there we go. Now, this is like a shortbread, and so it doesn't have any kind of leavening agent. The leavening agent is probably, if anything, that little bit of egg yolk that you added. We're gonna add flour inside though, and we're gonna add pastry flour. Pastry flour is not easy to find these days. I have had a hard time. So Bob's makes a really good pastry flour. Now, why do you use pastry flour? The reason why you use pastry flour is because it gives it a lighter texture. Inside different flours, depending on what it's for, there's gluten inside. So the higher the gluten content, the chewier it will be. So bread flour, for example, is very high gluten, and so it ends up being too chewy of a cookie. This is a light cookie that kind of just breaks apart, and I'll show you what it looks like. So we're gonna use pastry flour. So if you don't have pastry flour, I would say use all-purpose flour. You could try cake flour, but cake flour does have cornstarch in it usually, so that sometimes doesn't work. I did not try it with it. I was able to find pastry flour after a while. So I'm gonna mix it. And you're only gonna mix it until it forms a dough. So don't overwork it. And that's it. So once that dough comes together, you're ready to go. All right. And then you're just going to take this dough and you can shape it into rounds. Or if you want, you can mold these. And so I played around with a spritzer with this dough. Doesn't work well in a spritzer because it's a little too wet. So what I would say is if you have a mold or like a cookie cutter, you could use it in the shape of a cookie cutter. I have a mooncake mold. And so this mooncake mold will kind of give me that design if I push it out. And I did kind of, but it does, you can't see it really well, but there is a shape on there. So if you want, make them into rounds, which I did, and I baked them off. And then when you're ready, I'm gonna grab a cutting board. Once these have baked off, you're left with these really cute little rounds, like the ones that Julia showed you. And I've got that extra rose syrup. Have that extra rose syrup right here. And then I have candied rose petals. Now, these I was able to find on Amazon. They're not cheap. And so if you want, you can actually make edible flowers really easily. All it takes is egg whites and sugar. So you get your edible flowers, and they need to be edible. Bristol Farms has really great edible flowers if you're around a Bristol Farms, but you don't want just flowers that you pick off the side of the road. You don't know what has been sprayed on it and so forth. So just be careful with that. You want real edible flowers, and then you just coat them with a little bit of egg white and then sprinkle them with sugar, and they'll dry. So if you want, try to buy egg whites that are pasteurized if you're worried about that. So I'm going to take these and I'm going to crush some. And the rose syrup, we have a lot of great Persian markets around us, and they actually have a good selection of rose syrup. You can buy French rose syrup too, so different types of rose syrup. And there's my powder. So I'm going to take a little bit of this syrup, brush each of these cookies with it, and then sprinkle that really pretty rose petal right on top. And that pink is really pretty too, right there. And there you are. These really pretty little rose cakes. There you go.
Gorgeous, gorgeous.
Is so pretty. Are there other things that you can use that rose petal powder for? That's such a pretty product.
I would say you could put it on anything, even cakes. It's fragrant, but it is that rose water taste or flavor. So you have to like that. I love it. So I like rose ice cream even. So
Mariam Hassani has a question for us. She asked, would the actual rose petal non-candied work?
That would be a little chewy. But if you broke it up, you know, like just because a whole petal might be a little chewy to bite into with the cookie. But if you slivered it, although it's very easy to just, you know, as Chef Jessica said, to just brush a petal with some egg white and sugar, or put it into a dehydrator. And so then you'll get little crumbles if you'd like.
And then you did this food styling. Is that right, Francine, for your book?
Yeah.
And so there you have the fresh petals as decor with the rose cookie. And it looks like you might also have maybe some thyme or baby mint or something that you've added there.
Yeah, I think to just make the plate little, the food stylist put something, it does look like thyme, just to kind of do something green. I mean, mint is often something that we will see on a dessert plate. But I also think that if you play around with edible flowers, not only that wonderful fragrance of the rose, but lilacs, it's really interesting, and especially with chocolate, you could just take some chocolate and melt that, and then incorporate your flowers into it. And so then when you dip strawberries into it, you get this wonderful combination of the floral and the fruit, something that the Elizabethans really enjoyed. And I love that idea of the flowers, just like they were so precious with keeping their fruit, the same with edible flowers. And I love one of the instructions, which we could all copy kind of once we can have a Zoom dinner party. But the instructions on how to make a salad fit for a prince was the exact title of it. And the idea is to take a big salad bowl and put a roll at the bottom of the bowl so that the center will look higher when you put all the greens. And then to take a tall branch of rosemary and stick it into the roll so that it sort of is a centerpiece in the salad. And then to dangle from the rosemary pairs of cherries when they're in season, and you can get 2 cherries hanging, or whatever comes to your mind. But that idea of that kind of thoughtfulness into the visual look of a dish, I find very compelling. And they even had instructions on how to replicate a flower, how to make a flat sort of salad that incorporates with the colors and the arrangements of vegetables and fruit. If you look from above, it looks as if it's just a wonderful flower or garden. So very artistic, because interestingly, today we'll put a vase on our dinner table, but they didn't in Shakespeare's time. They would have thought we were crazy to put flowers. Anything on the table is fair game, it's edible. And so, no, the flowers would have been eaten from the vase, but you could have it in your salads.
Oh, that's great. Couple of questions here. Sue Purcell is curious, do you know whether there were more or less food allergies during this period?
That's an interesting question, because someone asked about food allergy like nuts, which are so common today, and asked as a substitute for the pistachios if you have a nut allergy. And so, you can always leave it out, or put whatever your crunchy substitute is. But I don't know, and that's an excellent question. I've never seen a reference saying, if this ingredient makes you ill, use this. I've never seen that reference. And I'm wondering, and maybe we'd have to turn to a physician or nutritionist in the audience to tell us, I'm wondering if as we progress and the ingredients are less pure, perhaps, we develop allergies, or maybe you just
child mortality, that the allergies would just have killed the less hardy children, and by the time they became adults, if they had survived all those meals, I don't know. Of course, there was also all that poisoning, and
they absolutely did reference that they thought some foods, especially some foods eaten at some parts of the day, were very dangerous. For example, milk was not something that was recommended to be drunk. In fact, there were many things written about milk being unhealthy for you. So perhaps some lactose thing. Certainly water. Even water, they used to write
here.
Water was unhealthy. In fact, Shakespeare has a line, "She is false as water," because water was so dangerous. You could get sick. And they didn't know about germs, but they just knew water wasn't to be trusted. And so there were some things that they wouldn't eat, but I don't know about allergies. I will look that up.
That's great. Suze also would love to see a presentation of table settings throughout the ages. So maybe that's something we could do for another session. It would also be interesting to look at table settings around the world and how different cultures like to present their grander meals and what some of the conventions are.
It is very fascinating. And beside the tableware itself, but even the dish is a very interesting to peek at historically and different cultures. I mean, I'm thinking of the wonderful boxes, Japanese boxes, where food is presented at this marvelous opening of a gift.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been reading The Life of Cleopatra, getting ready to teach Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And it's amazing to read about these feasts, and some of their food ways are quite fascinating. We're going to end in a few minutes. We will be sending out the recipes, and we can probably include, is the rose cookie recipe in the packet? Because I could just photocopy it and add it if it's not in there. But it is great. But maybe we could end by Francine, you're just telling us about how you came to write this book.
I will. And I also want to mention, just talking about the fancifulness of the table, I want to just mention one page that sort of shows to the extent that the host would go to amuse and to entertain you. And so this one explanation was that the chef should create a ship, a pastry ship, a ship made out of dough as a centerpiece, and then to give every guest a dinner roll in the shape of a cannon to kind of keep this battleship theme going. And the ship, the little rolls that look like cannons, should have some kind of accelerant on them, some camphor that could be lit and would make a little popping sound so that it would sound as if there was in fact a sea battle. Then they advised that you give every lady at the table an egg that had been hollowed out and filled with scented water, with the instruction being when the ladies start to hear the noise of the cannons popping, that they should throw their eggs on the floor so that it makes an additional popping, but so the wonderful fragrance of the eggs kind of gets away these sulfur smells from the rolls. So this is a pretty elaborate dinner party. That's even before the first bite is taken of your food.
Right. I think I've read that one. It's a wonderful cookbook that was written after the English Civil War, but remembering the glories of the court of Charles I. And so it was very much a royal setting and quite elaborate, really a whole narrative there that was kind of dramatized. It was quite extraordinary. But there's also nice, interesting cookbooks written by women of the period as well. Hannah Woolley, for example, who taught women and was quite an interesting character. And she has some very charming, more modest kinds of recipes, more Protestant, if you will, kinds of recipes that still are quite evocative of the time. So it's great.
Well, even in Shakespeare's time, there were handwritten manuscripts like the Sarah Long. And of course, a home cook would have more modest expectations. But again, you have to remember that back then, literacy was so low. So who was reading this cookbook? You're talking about the top 5% of the population who could have a home, who could entertain this way, who could read. And so clearly the cookbooks were much simpler. And in fact, I'm often asked at the end of these talks, well, these things are kind of fancy with the swans and the peacocks. By the way, someone asked, what does swan taste like? Tastes like chicken. No, I don't know actually. Although even written in the cookbooks of Elizabethan time, there were references to the fact that it's pretty, but it doesn't taste so great. Even back then, they did love the taste so much.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. Chef Jessica, always so great to work with you. This was just a delightful presentation, and we'll see you at another event. It was really great to host you.